Before I come to my topic, which was given as what would a free private city do with the pandemic situation, let me just shortly introduce the idea in a nutshell, because I don't know if everybody knows what free private city means. Imagine a private company offers you the basic services of a state, which is protection of life, liberty, and property in a defined territory. And you pay a fixed amount for those services per year. Your respective rights and duties are laid down in a written citizens contract, as I call it, between you and the city provider. For everything else, you do what you want. Instead of being subject to the government's or majority's ever-changing will, you are a real contracting party on equal footing with a secured legal position against the provider. And you only become a part of it if you like the offer. So in order to implement such a thing, which is called a free private city, internal autonomy would be necessary. This does not mean sovereignty under international law necessarily, but at least the right to regulate the city's own affairs independently. The establishment of a free private city therefore requires a contractual agreement with an existing state. In this agreement, the host nation grants the operating company the right to establish the free private city in a defined territory in accordance with the negotiated conditions. If you are interested in that model more deeply, then I would invite you to go to the website. It's freeprivatecities.com. And I've also written a book. It's available in several languages. It's also available in audiobook through Amazon, or just go to the website. Now, the question that came up, is this just a theoretical concept? Well, first and foremost, it is a concept, but we are already negotiating with some governments of making this happen. We have influenced some of the more advanced, I would say, special economic zone projects. There's even one project which is probably announced in the next weeks that has adopted this contractual model, which is unique in the world. So it's really slowly happening. This is a big project and a big concept. So it's not going to happen overnight. But there's a certain chance that we will see it happen during our lifetimes. Why can I be so sure that this is free private cities are the future? Well, we have heard today and yesterday several times that parts of government can be provided as a service, which is absolutely true, including dispute resolution. But government itself is a service, and the free private city is basically the final concept of putting all this together. These single services are put together in one service, protection of life, liberty, and property, by a service provider. And you have a social contract that cannot be changed at will by one side unilaterally. That is one of the big problems in our today's world, that rules are constantly changed, but never by our side. And last but not least, the operator in a free private city has a profit incentive to treat his customers well. And there's a big difference, and we will come back to this point when discussing the pandemic. Now let's go to the question, what would a free private city do in the situation of a pandemic? So first, we have to understand how this setup is working. So as I said, every single resident in a free private city would have a contract with the operating entity. And in this contract, there would be a clause that in special cases like war, natural disaster, calamities, there would be the possibility to limit the freedom of movement, for example, right? And on the other hand, you are always protected by a dispute resolution mechanism. So be it an arbitration panel or whatever you choose, or whatever you and the operator choose together, there's always something where you can go to and say, hey, this is not a natural disaster, what's happening here at the moment. So you can sue me, right? If I was the operator, let's assume for the rest of the talk, I am the operator and you are the customer, you are the client, the resident says, no, coronavirus is not a pandemic. It's just a normal influenza. I say, okay, but here are some evidences, and you can go to court and sue me, and then we will find out, right? But in this situation, I would say probably I would win. So the court would say, okay, there's really something special. People are dying more than usual in influenza times, and some doctors have died, and people on cruise ships have died, which is not normal in that season. So now we have an interesting situation because everybody has this contractual protection, and I basically promise protection of life, liberty, and property, and you pay for it. So you can claim damages against me if I'm not really fulfilling my promises. So there would be people who would say, well, let's assume there would be something like, okay, you cannot go out, right? Just as an assumption. I said, you cannot go out at certain times. And you would say, hey, this is against my liberties that you have promised you in my contract. And other people would say, no, if you do nothing, my grandma will maybe die, and then I sue you, and I sue you in advance because I do not want my grandma to die. So I'm kind of in between a rock and a hard place, right? So if you have some residents who say I want more protection, and others say I want less protection. The one side of the resident says it's because protection of life, and the other says it's because of protection of liberty. So now this is not an ideal situation for me, but I can tell you this is not bad, and it's especially not bad for you. Why? Because these two forces, they're both are justified. These force me as operator with every solution I come up with that it has to be proportional, right? I cannot overdo because it's just hiding behind the law. I am liable for what I do from both sides. So I have to carefully first be prepared. Well, here's the thing. A coronavirus is nothing new, right? We had SARS and we had MERS, and we had others before. They were also from the type of coronavirus. And there are a lot of studies were around said, hey, maybe this is coming again, so we have to be prepared. And there were some countries like France, they were throwing away their protection clothing just to save money. In Germany, they had a study in 2012, a big exercise in government. What happens if there's a new virus coming from Asia, right? They just disregarded anything that was recommended at that time. I mean, they can afford that, but I can't, right? So I have to be prepared as a private operator that is liable, because I know a pandemic can happen. A lot of people have predicted that. So I have to have at least some protection clothing, some mask, and maybe if some other things like thermometers to measure your temperature, something like that. It's not very expensive, right? And I have to have reserves for such calamities, be it a pandemic, be a natural disaster, flooding, whatever. I have to be prepared for that to a degree, okay? So that is the other difference, because I have other incentives. And the first principle in a free private city, if of course you are responsible for yourself, right? So if you're afraid of the virus, stay at home, right? It's as easy as that. On the other hand, I do not know, maybe the virus is really, really deadly so that people are just dropping dead like flies. So I cannot just go back and say, you're responsible for yourself, I do nothing. That is also not an option because people pay me for protecting them, right? And I say, okay, I have the infrastructure, I'm the private owner of the infrastructure of the city, so I have to do something, because otherwise people would say, okay, then we think a free private city is not attractive. If at the first calamity you're not protecting us, I'd better go back to my state. So I think the main difference, I will have to do something, especially in the early days when it was still uncertain, say in February or early March, it was still uncertain how deadly coronavirus is, right? Is it just kind of a heavy influenza, or is it really something that is, spreading heavily? We, at the beginning, said it's spreading heavily. People are probably have no basic immunity against it, and people die, right? So I've seen in northern Italy, many more people than usual have died. So in the beginning, there was a really risk, and I would say the minimum you could do as a city operator is that you close the borders and say no new entrants, and if new entrants are coming, they got 14 days in quarantine. That's, for example, how South Korea has reacted. South Korean cities have reacted to that. And no more cruise ships. right? So this was the first things. No more cruise ships if this was a port city, and quarantine for new entrants. For the rest, I would first, because I have to act proportional in order not to get sued, I would have say, okay, then we protect the risk groups. Probably no tourists are coming during Corona times, so a lot of hotels are empty. I could rent a hotel for affordable price and say, okay, who feels very threatened can go into that hotel. We have special doctors there with special protection clothing, and they make shopping for you. Another idea is, which is a low impact restriction, is that there's an hour a day, normally it's in the morning, the first hour, where only the elderly can shop, so that they are protected against infection, because if everybody's running around, young people have no problem, they're infected, but the elderly people are endangered. So that is, for example, something that's happening here in Monaco, right? First hour in the supermarket, only the elderly can shop. So it's relatively easy. It's not a really big restriction. And I can recommend social distancing, distributing masks, also not expensive, and do voluntary testing if I have some test kits. So this is all what I would do in the first degree, the first step, which is still, somewhat restrictive, but it's still no lockdown at all. It's basically your decision. If you think, okay, I better stay inside. The schools are run privately. They can decide if they want, right? What we had in many countries, if schools are still open, the teachers say we do not want to go to school because we are afraid that the pupils will infect us, right? In other cases, the parents will say it's too dangerous for us, so we're not sending our pupils to school. It's up to them, and it's up to the school operator to discuss this with parents. I have no problems if some schools are opening and others are closing. And the same applies for factories and businesses, right? That's what they deal with on their own. So this is basically how you would start into that. And this is because I have another incentive compared to a politician. A politician probably cannot afford that, because if people are dying, even if it's very, very old people who were already very ill, it will be in the press and they will blame you. If you lock down everything and people got insolvent, people are depressed, people will maybe even die at some point in time. It's not in the press, right? It's not really that urgent a problem for a politician, right? So we have to understand politicians. They have to choose the most stricter thing to basically be safe, and then also they can demonstrate how active they are and all of that. I have none of those incentives. I have, again, people who say do more and people who say do less, and I'm in between and have to navigate through. Now let's assume, so what we can say now in partly hindsight is that would have worked, right? You can see Sweden have some more death, but it worked. So there was no collapse of the medical system. There's no collapse of the hospitals. And if some people more are dying now, then probably this will happen in the other places later. So I think that would have been the situation. Now, the other thing is what would have happened if really the medical system would collapse in my free private city, because I have hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of people going into the hospital with COVID symptoms. But in such case, then I have to make a stricter lockdown, right? And then maybe even after a while, when the situation is improving, I will open up. So in this case, it wouldn't have been so much of a difference, but in the first case that I've described you, we would have gone through that coronavirus pandemic much easier, with not more damage, and especially with less damage to the economy. And that is, in my view, part of the function of the private liability of the city operator. And last but not least, hopefully there wouldn't have been only just one free private city, but many free private cities all over the world at one point in time, or other special jurisdiction, where we would have always a look how they do it. How does it work there? Can we copy things that work, that are less restrictive to our residents? And that is, the more the case, the more such entities you have, the more special jurisdictions you have, you can really study much better what is working and what is not.